Okay, so we're here today to find out more about the Vietnamese War, the war in Vietnam. Were you drafted, or where did you enlist? I was drafted in 1970. I dropped out of college, Golden West Community College in Huntington Beach, California. Started doing a lot of gambling and drinking with some buddies of mine who came out and ruined my life, and ended up flunking out of school. And so I was immediately drafted. I was told to report for induction 6 months, but I decided to go in earlier. So I went home to my hometown, Coldwater, Michigan, and then went to Detroit, Michigan, was inducted into the military in 1970. Took my basic training in Fort Knox, where Fort Knox is. And afterwards, at the end of the cycle, they asked me if I wanted to go to West Point. I told them no, I'd rather not go to West Point, because that would have been a 4-year commitment for college and then a 4-year commitment in the military, and I'd already decided that I didn't like the military. So I refused their offer, and of course they then told me, well, you know, you're going to go to Vietnam, and I said, everybody's going to Vietnam, go ahead and send me there. And so they figured out I was too smart to be an infantryman, even though I was the best shot in the brigade, and so they made me a medic. And so I went to Fort Sam Houston, took my medic training at Fort Sam Houston on what's called the Lower Hill. And during that time period, they tried to shock you as much as they could to make sure that you would not crumble when you went into combat, because of you're going to see a lot of blood and guts. So they showed you a lot of blood and guts, mostly on camera, but then they bring out things and try to scare you. And if you got frightened or weren't able to handle it, then they'd drum you out of the medical corps and send you to the infantry. So I stayed in the medical corps. I went to Chulai, then I went to Hill Fire Base 555, and I spent 6 months in the 1st of the 52nd Americal Division. Happens to be the same division that Cali and My Lai. It's the same I Corps, same unit. And so at one point I was at My Lai for about 3 weeks. It was quite a difference from when they were there, which was about a year earlier. But you saw the damage from the the kids and the people who were losing limbs and things like that. It was pretty awful. The only kind of pressure you put on yourself in a war situation is your personal pressure. And of course, at first I had a lot of pressure because I didn't really, I went from, stateside to a 3-day training camp to the bush in less than a week. And of course, I had a lot of pressure because I didn't know how I would react, when somebody needed me. And of course, it didn't take long for me to find out, because, there were, lots of booby traps, and, that's how most of the injuries that I worked on, that's where the people, and they lived or died depending on where they were standing at the time. And of course, then there were half a dozen firefights and things like that. And of course, I treated, the American soldiers, and of course, any of the Vietnamese, any of the wounded from the other side, they were immediately shot in most cases. So, it wasn't something, because you're out and you can't take prisoners. It's not something that you do very often, but it didn't happen very often. People didn't like to do that. So, I don't think that there was a lot of, the people talk about baby killers, and people talk about, My Lai and things like that happened during the war, and people got the idea that that was the way it was all the time, and that was not true at all. Most of the people that I worked with were, sympathetic. They were empathetic to the civilian population, but at the same time they were wary of them, because you didn't know who was your enemy and who was your friend. So it's very difficult to figure out how you're going to treat one person over another, because this person who looks like, who could be a friend of yours, at night they could be the person who's, trying to kill you. So the pressure was there to try to get along, but to stay alive. And so, you tried to work together in order to do that. And so we were not really in situations where you wanted to be aggressive and go in and try to find something to make a war out of, or to have a battle with somebody. You tried to do the least amount possible, and the officers pretty much did the same thing. The least amount possible to try to save as many lives as they could,
mostly of their own troops. And so, there were certain situations where there are things that maybe we should, in a war situation where you knew where the enemy was and you knew what you were fighting for and you knew what you wanted to do, then you would say, okay, let's go do this. But in most of the cases in Vietnam, it was more about avoidance. You tried to avoid firefights. You tried to avoid areas where you knew they were, and they were just waiting for us. And so, this was toward the end of the war. I don't know how it was earlier in the war. Earlier in the war in Vietnam, there were mostly regular Army, Marines, Army soldiers, STRAC units, really professional guys. And of course, that wasn't the case towards the end of the war when most of the guys over there were drafted. So it was a different scenario. So it was a lot of pressure because of that. When you go into a war situation like that and you're trying to, take care of one another, but at the same time you don't get too close to one another because, the guy you're talking to could be dead a day later. And so you didn't really get close to him. You got close enough to make sure that they knew that you were trying to protect one another and all that other stuff, but you didn't really get too close. And so I never got really, really close with anybody. Plus the medics were separate, kind of like a separate entity. And we hung out in the rear. We hung out with ourselves, with the medics and the docs. But we didn't hang around with the regular soldiers that much. So when I came home, I really didn't know where all the guys that I'd served with, plus the units were breaking up so fast when we were over there, you really didn't have time to make long, bonds with people. But when they opened up the Vietnam War Memorial, the wall in Vietnam, in Washington, D.C., I went there with a buddy of mine, Don Keefe, and he had arranged for us to be part of the committee, and we had VIP seats. We went to visit with senators and congressmen, and with Senator Warner, who was actually one of the people who helped put the wall together, and so we were sitting on the dais on the day that they opened the Vietnam War Memorial, and there were 500,000 soldiers there. And it was just a sea of people, and it was just an incredible experience. Probably more emotional than anything ever happened to me in Vietnam was the unveiling of the wall, because it was really something that was special.